So before we turn it over to them, I just want you to know Blue Novus is a human connection company that provides mental health and emotional well-being services through proactive or upstream person-to-person support, an online educational platform, management training, executive coaching, and crisis management. And with that, I'll turn it over to James Hadlock of Blue Novus to kick this off and introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Whoa, it's live. Hey, thank you everybody for joining us today. We had I thought a really interesting conversation in the previous session, and this is going to probably look a whole lot different, because we're just going to kind of go with the flow. But to give you just a little bit of context of what we'll be covering today, in our first keynote, there was a lot of talk about the general statistics around mental illness in the United States. And in our discussion today, what we're going to be really reviewing, covering, and having a conversation about is the impact of mental health in the workplace and what we can do as leaders and as employees to reduce the stigma. The number one reason that people don't reach out and get help is because of stigma. But do you know what the number two reason is? Job concern. How will I be viewed if I take a mental health day? How will I be viewed if people find out that I get anxious sometimes? How will I be looked at for that promotion if people know XYZ? So we're going to have a really interesting discussion, but before we get started with that, I want to introduce our panel. As David mentioned, I am James Hadlock. I'm one of the co-founders and the chief evangelist at Blue Novus, and this has been a passion of mine because for a long time, I was that person in the workplace that lived with mental illness. And I had, back in the early 2000s, one of the fastest growing companies in Utah and was recognized as one of the top entrepreneurs here in the state. What people didn't know is that I was struggling with insomnia, with anxiety, depression, self-worth issues, and eventually I started to self-medicate. And I got to go on a journey for about 11 years where I was in and out of drug and alcohol treatment centers. I was placed in psychiatric care for a number of occasions. Unfortunately, 13 and a half years ago, I had a transformational experience. And ever since that time, I've been fascinated with mental health, but more importantly, I've been really passionate about helping other people and wanting to support them. And that was kind of the start of our organization. And with that, let's go ahead and let's start this time with you, Reza. Why don't you just give us a little bit of your background? You're an organizational psychologist, and I think it would be really relevant to share with people a little bit about not only your background professionally, but some of the work you've been doing with the state around remote work.
Yeah, so Reza Hamadi, I run a management and leadership consultancy here in Salt Lake and the Bay Area. And like James said, I'm an organizational psychologist, a student of organization in general. And I've done a lot of things for the past 21 years or so. But one of the things that I actually had an opportunity to do, like you were saying, is this. This is really, the timing of this was unbelievable, but the state reached out. I'd done a lot of work over the years in helping organizations think about flexibility, both from the standpoint of how you manage your HR, but your facilities and so forth. And so they reached out, and we formed a partnership with the GOMB, the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, and helped build essentially what is the state of Utah government's remote work program. It used to be called Utah Works. Now it's called a New Workplace and run by a great guy named Jeff Modeshaw, still in that office. So we actually, my final deliverable in that project was March 6, 2020. And, I'm dealing with, here's the policies and here's how you can set it up, get maximum impact. And they were doing the IT things and getting all the infrastructure ready. I think it was March 16th or 19th, suddenly the entire state they cleared out, everybody went home, and I think close to about 20,000 state employees went remote. And since then, my goal professionally was to move away from what we're calling now hybrid work, but in reality, it's just been telecommuting is the actual term around it for the past couple decades. And my idea was to move away from that and do other things. But now the requests continue to come in around hybrid work, and it's opened up so much opportunity to understand things around mental health connected to that aspect of flexibility. So if you turn sort of the term hybrid work and just change it to flexibility, what possibilities does it open up? So that was a really long-winded introduction, but maybe. But
it's going to be, I think, an interesting launching pad to talk about the remote work environment. But let's hear from you first, Lorraine, and if you would just share a little bit about your background, Lorraine Wright. I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, my name's Lorraine Wright, and I'm co-founder of a company my husband and I have that it does executive coaching and leadership development. And then we also have a fractional CHRO practice where we have several individuals that come in and help really growing companies develop their HR practices and that strategy. And we work a lot with leaders that are really trying to scale large organizations or entrepreneurs that are working with very fast-growing companies to manage mostly the toll that they are taking on the leadership.
Well, and before you did that, you were in corporate America for how long?
Right. I was in corporate America for I was in corporate America for probably about 20 years, and then I was a consultant to corporate America for another 10. And so that was working in that environment and that structure, I have a lot of experience in that.
And you worked with a couple of pretty well-known organizations.
The first company was American Express. Sorry, I'm like not going. I'm not
feeding
finding
you.
Yes, you are. So I worked as an executive with American Express for 15 years, and then healthcare, Catholic Healthcare West, which was then bought by Dignity Health, 47 hospitals along California and Arizona and Nevada. And then I went into my own consulting firm and still did consulting to pretty much the Fortune 100 for the next 7, almost 10 years. Intel, Chevron, Carlson Companies. Yeah, it was interesting.
Thank you. All right, Marshall Pepke. Marshall, you've had a background in HR. You also do a lot of leadership and executive coaching. But tell us a little bit about your background, because you do have that human resource background.
Yeah, Marshall Papke. I started my career with Mountain America Credit Union in '97, and I was an intern and spent about 12 years in HR, became the SVP of HR, and then jumped over to the executive team and did that for 10 years. So I've been able to see organizations from different perspectives. Then in 2018, started a executive coaching and consulting company, and work with companies across the country right now. So it's been fun, because I believe everything comes back to people in organizations. Without people, you don't have organizations. So how do you build an organization that is really people-centric?
One of the titles, I don't know if it was the official title, but I think it may have been for this summit, was Back to School, Back to Work. And when you couple that with mental health, let's talk about that a minute, because I know that there are all kinds of conversations, and we're hearing some companies are going all the way back to work, some are not. There's a hybrid, there's something maybe in between, but there's a lot of discussion about people's emotional well-being related to just that one topic alone. And since you've got the mic, Marshall, why don't you talk about that? Like, what do you see, whether it's with clients or what's your perspective on how can we better address, and not saying we need to do this or that as far as the logistics of work, but how as leaders can we better support our people during this unknown time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I did, knowing we were going to be talking about these topics, I did reach out to some of my friends who are executives with some companies here in Utah and asked for their feedback. And I want to share some of that feedback with you and where they were similar, because they were different but similar. One, I think of the major things is flexibility. I think we've learned that having a defined approach, that there's only one way to do something in an organization, has changed, and probably forever. So some organizations are looking at, having everybody so they can work remote. And that may or may not work for people. It may not work for some companies. I think other things that we're learning about is, like we're talking about mental health. How do we help people that are no longer in a place where we can interact with them one-on-one? How do we help them with their mental health needs? And how do we help them with their other needs? It's changed the environment from a perspective of how do leaders manage workers remotely, which is very different than managing people when they're on site. So I believe that part of this going back to work, or going back to work as we're talking about with our kids and whatnot, I think there's certain, on a joke, this is a joke, by the way, so my jokes are so dry, I have to warn you. I bet there's a lot of stay-at-home moms or dads who are really having great mental health right now because all the kids are leaving, going back to school. I think that the leadership part of it is really critical, and not being so tied up in, like you're saying, the tactical, but the strategic. What culture do we want? How do we want people to feel? What do we want the future to be? Building things around that so that you become a best place to work, or a place that people really want to be, especially in this tight labor market.
So I've seen a lot of different things, and I from different companies and friends that through my career that are now running those companies. And it's interesting for me because the ones that seem to be doing the best are the ones who have asked their employees what they'd like. So I feel that instead of it being dictated by a group of a senior group that says this is the way the organization should be, that the best success is by asking people, what do you want? Because then it's very different. One organization, saying we're letting it down to the team level decide when they're coming into the office, but they've decided that they want to come into the office. They miss one another, so they're going to come in a couple of days. And so there's other things other than just the flexibility, but it's also the relationship building. It's how they feel valued and connected to one another as a team. And I love the idea of connecting all the dots, because it can't be just remote work separately. You have to connect it to then culture, customers, all those different sort of constituents that you have in a company, and make sure that they all have, congruency, that people feel that you're making a decision with each of them in mind.
Yeah, I mean, this is a topic that I've been chewing on a lot, and my opinion on it has shifted a few times here and there. But what I've come to understand, what I've come to understand in terms of flexibility, remote work, all those types of things, is that it's actually a little bit of a proxy or an indicator for overall organizational health. So, and when I think about individual mental health, right? And how are we creating an environment where individuals thrive? That's very closely linked in my mind to a thriving culture. And whether you're running you're leading, these are well-led people or not, right? And so when I look at, I've had an opportunity now over the past year, but also over the past decade to do a lot of surveys and kind of analysis on, how do we do flexible work? How do we do hybrid work, telecommuting and all that? And typically the organizations that resist it, they'll ask the question, what do you want? And then when they hear from organization or from the employees what they actually want, the ones that put the brakes on really quickly, if you snoop around and look around, you'll find a whole bunch of other issues. And it typically is related, for me, when you dig deep enough, it comes down to the issue of trust that you mentioned in our last session. Is, do I trust that the output of this organization, and do I trust these people, if I let them loose to figure out how they want to work and how they want to do these things, are they going to be able to deliver on what we need to deliver? So that's one component of it. Now we double click on it, and it connects to something else that is very, very core to an individual's mental health in any system there are. And I know this is one of the things that you know a lot about, but that's the self-determination theory items, right? Autonomy, providing growth, learning opportunities, and connectedness. All those connect to the issue of flexible work, where you are from a location standpoint. Do I give you the autonomy and I empower you to go out and do the work and not care where the hell you are? That kind of stuff. I mean, you can see there's a lot of connections, and typically when I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but when you look at how an organization, their sort of immediate gut reaction to possibilities or the extent of telework or hybrid work, whatever you want to call it, there's other things at play that directly impact how they might be leading that touch on mental health.
So it's not necessarily the final decision that's made, it's how we go about it that is maybe most important in relationship to employees, because you're right, every organization is a little different. Every organization has different needs, and it's made up of people, and those people are all different, right? So talk to me more about how do we build the kind of environments that feel psychologically safe. We've heard already the term of it's important to build trust, which to me is just another way of talking about psychological safety in the workplace. And so how do we do that? Like, what are some things that you see that we as leaders and organizations can do to make it feel a little bit safer for people to not necessarily come forward and share everything about their life, but at least to lean in and say, I may need some help?
So a couple of things on there. Words I would use is, we talked about vulnerability, as being one of the key indicators or key opportunities for leaders to come out and create that psychological safety by being vulnerable and sharing something maybe that they've struggled with, which is hard for leaders to do, because it makes them feel like they're not perfect or they are susceptible to judgment. I would say another couple things that are really important are kindness and caring. Now, I want to illustrate that I didn't use the word nice. And as I've studied the difference between kindness and niceness, nice generally has an ulterior motive to it. And so we're nice because we want something out of the relationship or we want something from the person. So it's, in my opinion, it's a passive-aggressive behavior. So if you're a kind organization, I think you're doing well. If you're a nice organization, you may want to look at, is it really psychologically safe in that environment because of how you treat people? I hope that makes sense. If not, so do some research, or I'm happy to share the research I've done.
Well, and I don't want to assume anything, because we may be talking on this level of psychological safety. What are some of, so before we go any deeper with psychological safety, let's talk about what are some of the characteristics of a psychologically safe company?
You want to say? I'll say a few, but either way.
You start.
Okay, so I would say, really going back to the trust that you can be who you are, you can be authentic, you can share openly your concerns, or you can recognize others and feel like you're not brown-nosing, right? You're not going to be labeled. I would say that some of those just simple things like that really mean that it's psychologically safe here to be myself, authentic. I can be who I am.
Yeah, and I would say that an organization that does what it says, right? So in language, they don't say one thing and then show up a different way. So they show up the way they say they will, and they do what they say they will. So that creates a very safe environment, because the part that starts to become really unsafe is when you don't know when you're unsafe, right? So if I think I hear you, then this is what I'm going to believe. But then after you've said that, if that wasn't true and I wasn't safe, it's not just trust. Mm-hmm. I now know I'm not safe based on what you say to me. So do what you do, show up the way you say you're going to show up, and that those pieces start to affect culture, performance, customer loyalty. I mean, all of that, just show up the way you say you're going to, do what you say you're doing.
And building on both of those points, the piece around, being able to say what you want to say, having your, like, let's say your team hear that, and knowing that they're not going to go afterwards and have other conversations that happen. Basically, everything happens in that space, that we agree we're going to have this conversation, and you're going to let me speak, and you're going to respect my opinion, and likewise, and so forth. And I know that it's not going to go somewhere else. That's, trust at a group level like that. And it's so often, it's just like a couple of days ago, I was literally sitting in a room where somebody was telling me we had this and it happened. And then 5 hours later, so-and-so came to me and said, I talked to these 5 people and this is what they really thought. And, and something to be concerned about. Right.
Side conversations, right? So the conversation after the conversation. Yeah, validating. And I think one thing to add to what you were sharing is consistency, right? People would rather deal with somebody who's mean when they're consistently mean because they know that what they're going to get. But they don't like the person who's all over the place. They don't like not knowing who you're going to show up as today. And that can speak to mental health issues. So part of the challenge potentially in the workplace is if you have leaders who are suffering with mental health and they're showing up differently in the workplace, it creates that space where there's not psychological safety because I can't trust who you're going to be today. So maybe one of the things we could talk about a little bit about and throw this back to you, maybe a panelist can throw some questions to you, is what do you do when you have leaders who are suffering from mental health, and how does that impact the organization, maybe at even a higher level than mental health amongst the people at large?
Yeah, that's a loaded question because I think I think some of it depends on who's the leader. Are there other stakeholders that you can talk to? But I think it goes back to culture. And if you can have the kind of culture where, everyone likes to talk a big game, but can you really walk that walk? And is there a culture where even someone who maybe doesn't have a senior leadership position can have an open dialogue with someone about mental health? I think that's what we're talking about. That's the real crux of it, right? Is we want to be able to have these type of conversations in a meaningful way with people, in a respectful way, and do it with genuine concern. So if I were in that position and I didn't know, anything else, if it was just a leader that I was concerned about, I'll tell you what I would do. I would connect with them. I wouldn't try to fix them. I wouldn't try to confront them. I would take the time to just sit down with them and there's something amazing that happens when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and allow ourselves to be in the moment with someone, and they can feel that genuine concern. And it doesn't matter if they're my dad, my CEO, or one of my employees. Like, part of the human experience is that we all long to belong. We all want to feel heard. And when you do that without any agenda or expectation, that connection alone, oftentimes they may still not feel safe enough to talk to you, but it might unlock something in them to talk to somebody.
That's really good.
What question do you have?
I have a question.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So this kind of really briefly ties to remote work, and then I want to give you the question. Is one of the issues that remote work could potentially cause is you're isolated, and which could be a contributor to loneliness, right? And so they're not necessarily exactly the same thing, but one, definitely your relationships might erode, and so loneliness can arise. And depending on where you're looking, Vivek Murthy, who is the former Obama's Surgeon General, recently has a book out. He's done some research. It's called Together, and he basically calls loneliness an epidemic in U.S. society, right? And can tie it to a whole bunch of health outcomes. So when people would come into his hospital, he'd ask, well, here's what's going on. You've got these serious, complicated diseases and so forth, and trace it down to, emotionally this person is in a place that's pretty difficult, and a lot of that is tied to their loneliness. And I can't help but think, I mean, we spend about half of our waking lives in some sort of organizational life, right? Like we're somehow tied to work, or that's what we're doing. And I haven't really fully explored what we can do to combat issues around loneliness that might arise out of the organizational settings that we create. But I'm curious, I mean, in your work, have you come across that? And
Wow, the tables have turned, haven't they? I immediately think about, if I do not feel safe in the workplace, if I feel like I have to have my guard up and I cannot allow myself to be vulnerable and open, what chances are there that I'm actually connecting with my coworkers? So I may be around all of you, but if I'm not able to be myself, I'm not really connecting with you on a deeper level. And if I'm not connecting with you on a deeper level, no wonder we feel so lonely. I say all the time, we're more connected today technologically than we've ever been in the history of the world, and yet more people feel lonely than ever before. And oftentimes I'll have people that will question me on, well, I'm so zoomed out. How many of you have felt that just burned out on Zoom? We just Zoom all the time. But here's just something to consider. I want you to notice your behaviors when you're on a Zoom call. Are you really in the present moment? Are you focused in that experience, or do you have 3 other browsers open and you're texting because you don't even have your camera on because you're so distracted with everything else? So one of the things that I have noticed, and I do a lot of trainings online, and one of the trainings I do is specifically around how to have a deeper connection, even through a Zoom call. And wouldn't you know it, when people allow themselves to get present, when they are willing to listen and just be immersed in that experience, guess what they experience? Connection, the opposite of loneliness. And so, I'm going to go back to what Dr. Rappaport said in the opening keynote around. I want you to notice the correlation between how we live our lives and how our kids are living our kids were born with a phone in their hand, almost, right? And I want you to notice how little that they're just living in the present moment. They're living in some never land, and look at what's happening. One of the questions I wanted to ask him is, why have the numbers exploded the way they have? And is it possible that it's loneliness? Is it possible that there's a relationship with connection? I see that relationship myself. I don't have necessarily all the data to support it, but I think just on a human intuition level, it is all about connection.
Yeah, and I would add to that, it's been interesting to watch as organizations have gone through a cycle of performance efficiency, right? Bottom line efficiency, process innovation. Some organizations have reached out and said, you know what, we're really good at what we do, but no one is curious anymore. No one is creative anymore. We're really good at doing what we're doing and, limiting cost and getting down to 0 defects or whatever, but we cannot be innovative. And it goes back to allowing then people to come, when they come with their whole selves to work, not always working just from the mind, but coming from the heart. And when you combine heart and mind at work, then you start to have more conversation around curiosity, more conversation around innovation, more conversation around feelings. What does it feel when you serve a customer really well versus, okay, move on to the next. It's all about the numbers. So there's this combination that starts to happen, that starts like a livelihood going on in the organization again. And then people start to feel connected again because it isn't such a clear process. There is more innovation, connection going on.
I'm gonna give you guys an opportunity if you want to ask some questions. Just by a raise of hands, who'd like to ask a question to our panel? Anything around mental health in the workplace?
So my husband has a former boss who was demoted and is now a coworker because he's a micromanager. And so my husband was first hired, this guy was his boss. And then 2 years go by and he went from being really positive and, excited and you're the guy who's going to save the department kind of talk to everyone's against me and you're one of them now. And he would lean over my husband and tell him, I can do that better than you, move over. And I wondered if he had a stroke, but I think that's just his personality. And so my husband tried everything he could think of to, how can I, work in these conditions? And this is a really long explanation, but now he's a coworker, but he's still doing those same porcupine kind of behaviors. And what can you do as an employee who's not an employee, now he's a coworker, in that situation where my husband's tried to have conversations and the behavior is always the talk. There's no psychological safety because the talk is, I'll be better, I'll do better, I understand, definitely I'll change, but then it doesn't happen. What do you do in that situation?
There's a lot of options here, so we'll go with the loving ones first. It's tough because we are who we are to a degree, but we can change if we choose. So today I was reading an article that basically said, what do you do to coach the person who doesn't want to change? And the answer is, you don't. They don't want to change. Why are you going to waste your time? Until they're ready to change, they're not going to change. So, my advice, can we pause the recording? My advice is, if your husband isn't finding joy in that department, to find another department. Sometimes if an organization isn't going to address or fix a challenge that's happening, then we have to choose with our feet a better choice for ourselves. That's my solution, and I think it's loving for all around. Now, I wish the story would turn out that somebody could sit down and have a heart-to-heart, and all of a sudden self-awareness popped in, and things would change. But this is mental health. This person may have some mental health issues where they see the world from a different perspective than we do, and that they actually think they're being helpful. Sometimes micromanagement comes down to that.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that, and I don't want to pass the buck or put more pressure on your husband, is just fully acknowledging that you're never going to change somebody else's behavior. So if there's some willingness outside of walking to another, going to another department, of figuring out what are the 2-3 things I need in this relationship and what can I do to set up that context for that to occur. And this happens a lot actually in coaching conversations where somebody's blaming that's happening. Well, what could you different? Well, I could do X, Y, and Z, or talk about that issue and let him sleep overnight before I talk to him about things like that can go a long way by understanding how the other person thinks. This is actually where the psychometrics kind of come in a little bit. Understanding how the other person thinks and leveraging that to your advantage.
Another question.
So I'm a leader in a lot of different things in my school and my major and church and everything. And I have mental illness. When I just completely check out, I feel like everything around me is crumbling, and all the people who are either under me or support me or I'm in charge of, it just crumbles as well. How do I and I'm speaking to this like to ask you guys to be a little vulnerable at this, since you are leaders. How do I, when I am not capable of leading, how do I lead?
So I can't say that I completely understand your experience or can relate to it, but just looking back a couple of months, I was at a tough spot, having 2 years of pandemic and so, right? And and I have some responsibilities toward other people, and the only thing that I was left with in that point was being completely frank. This is what's going on. James, you probably heard that conversation, right? I need help. This is what I need for X amount of time. I think I'll revisit the conversation. And that may not be very helpful advice, but just coming out and saying, this is where I'm at right now, and I'm doing my best, and this is the limit, please. And it can potentially be an opportunity for other people to rise up.
I think I would encourage you to do a self-inventory and find out, what is it that takes me to that edge where I can't lead? Know yourself, right? Start to know what those contributing factors are. And then once you know that, kind of say, well, where and how can I fix those things? A tool that I have given a lot of leaders is to manage their energy, not their time. And Harvard did a great article on this where they talked about just know where you have high energy moments or high energy days. Monday may not be a high energy day for everybody. So don't tackle a really hard project on Monday if that's a lower energy day. Go through your to-do list. Go talk to people you need to talk to. Match your energy with the level of work that you have to do, because you'll by far be a lot more productive. And it's a great article. If you come and talk to me, I'll make sure you get it. But it really helps you see yourself differently and managing to like your own natural rhythms versus kind of this stoic structure that may not work for you. And it really gives you permission to kind of start finding areas where you can give back to yourself while you're trying to lead.
Great ideas, and thanks for being vulnerable. My 2 cents for you would be this. I think it's amazing that just with a bunch of strangers you're vulnerable and tell us that you're struggling with this. I would say that that's number one. I would say let those that you work with know that you have some of your own challenges, and here's what they are. Just like I would tell people that I'm not the most detail-oriented person, and that's my weakness, so I need you to help me with details on occasion. So they knew where they could support me. I would also encourage you as a leader in a variety of different areas, who are you helping to build their leadership skills? So when you aren't there or aren't at the place where you can lead like you want to lead, that's an opportunity for somebody else to grow. And so you both can grow. You can grow by sharing with them some of your personal challenges, and you can help them have an opportunity to step in and rise to the occasion. So I think it's amazing what you've just done here. I think that's a huge step. So that's my 2 cents.
We have time for one more question right there.
Thank you for sharing your different perspectives. That's really enlightening to me. Can you suggest maybe a few red flags that we might look for to see if people are not coping well, that they might be reaching the limit of their mental capacity to be a good coworker, and that they might need to get some additional resources?
Yes. No, I'm just kidding. Yes. A couple of things I would suggest. One is we really do need to understand probably better the people we work with than we currently do. So I'm a big fan of assessments, both for an individual to understand themselves well, but also for the leaders to understand where they're coming from. And it's amazing how similar we are, but it's also amazing how different we are. So if I have a good understanding of how we are similar and different, I can better identify, are they in the state of mind, or are they in the state of behaving or performing what I expect or what's been determined? When that starts to gravitate or move or shift, when the words are no longer soft like they usually are, they become a little bit more coarse, I can begin to identify what's going on and then have that conversation with them to say, I noticed this. So it comes down to what we talked about earlier, the caring and the kindness. If we understand them well enough and love them well enough, and I know this is a word that we don't use in the workplace often, but if we love the people we work with, I think we're reaching a point where we can understand them better and connect with them better so that we can help them and be aware.
Yeah, I would, there's always a lot of red flags. Attendance tends to be a really first red flag, the reliability of someone. I would encourage any leader to incorporate, whether you think there's red flags or not, more how do you feel questions about their work. When you give a new assignment, how do you feel about that? Find out, are they feeling overwhelmed? Are they feeling like they have the right skills to do it, that they know they have clarity on what needs to be done? So just interjecting more, how does that make you feel? How, oh, this is a great job. How does that make you feel? Just those feeling statements gives you a better clue, and it also helps you really understand and know them better. There's also a really wonderful book called The Mind of a Leader that talks a lot about compassion in leadership. And when people first look at compassion, they think, oh, that means that I have to care for everyone. But it really means that the compassion shows up to allow others to show up as they are, and yet still hold, the organizational requirements of accountability and everything in place. But it helps you become more transparent with one another when you can feel compassion and empathy towards each other. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to add, but it just very simply, if there's a change, like you mentioned, reliability, if there's a change, if you notice some change in something you've come to expect from that person, that's...
Yeah, and those changes can vary. I mean, they can vary from if they're talking about things that they haven't talked about before, like I'm not able to sleep at all. It really is that change in behavior is the biggest indicator. And one of the things I would recommend, I'm going to go back to, when you can demonstrate genuine concern, that kindness and caring piece, without really looking at it as trying to fix them or be punitive about what's going on, but take some time to just be curious. Try to understand what's going on. And the more that you do that, they're going to lean in. And, we could have a whole talk about polyvagal theory, which we won't. But there is an innate ability in us when we feel safe that we can't help but lean in.
Can I add one thing?
Just
Two?
one.
Just one?
Just
Okay.
one.
So here's a critical thing, and I failed at this when I was an executive, I feel like, is if we're too busy as a leader, we're not going to see the red flags. So we have to slow down. And if we're not with the people, and it doesn't necessarily have to be physically, it can be Zoom or whatnot, if we're not in their presence, we also can't see what's going on. We may hear things, or we may have data that can tell us what's going on, but not at the level by which we can have the compassion, the kindness, and the caring.
Thank you, everybody. That went fast. I mean, for me, it did. I don't know about all of you, but thank you so much for attending this summit. I know that we have a little bit more of a break, and then we're going to have our final keynote, I think, in the where we started the summit in the first place. So thank you so much. Take care, and remember to stay connected. Bye-bye.